I feel like Miles Morales for the PS5 is an amazing game that lives up to the hype of its predecessor and is actually on par with it, and albeit different ways from the original. In order to get this point across, I'll be comparing the two games in terms of gameplay and story, and I figured that this was the perfect time to get this video out, considering that the release for Spider-Man 2 is right around the corner.
Never mind!
Without further ado, let's get into this. The difference in the quality of the story between these two games is where I feel the lack of contention when it comes to which is the superior game mostly stems from. However, when you factor in the difference between what these two games are, it becomes less of an issue. Miles Morales is a 5-hour game, while Peter Parker is a fully fleshed out game with side missions, etc. that all help to flesh out the characters and give them all satisfying conclusions by the end of the story. This is why I feel like Peter Parker's story feels better when compared to Miles, but at the end of the day, it really wasn't a fair race. They both have competent stories, but I feel like this lack of time to get the story across is most evident in the difference between the Tinkerer and Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus is a phenomenal villain because we see him transition from a person that genuinely wants to do good and improve the world to someone who is blinded by revenge and simply wants to get revenge on the man that wronged him. And this is believable because we see his slow descent into madness over the course of the story from his declining mental and physical condition. This is where the extra time allotted to Spider-Man Peter Parker really comes out to shine, because we get to see this over the course of hours upon hours of gameplay, while Miles Morales, even if he wanted to attempt something similar, would have had significantly less time. Speaking of this lack of time, let's move on to the Tinkerer. The Tinkerer is a decent villain, but at times she can be genuinely annoying. Her motivations go from reasonable to irrational towards the end of the game, as she jeopardizes the lives of thousands of people just to get revenge on a multi-billion-dollar corporation that can rebuild. Her character motivation is enough to justify her initial plan. However, when it really starts to go awry, that's when she really starts to lose me and becomes a bit more annoying. Also, her inability to listen to Miles, despite having clear evidence that what he is saying is at least somewhat true, is just baffling and really makes her come off as just stubborn. However, both of these gripes could be addressed and maybe even more thoroughly explored if the game had the luxury of more time, and I keep on reiterating this point, but this is largely just to say that for what Miles Morales had, it did accomplish a lot. However, this is not an excuse, and Peter Parker still does have the better story. I started with the villains because they tend to be the star of any piece of Spider-Man related media, and to have this be one of Doc Ock's best depictions ever, and to have this depiction of the Tinkerer just be as she is, I find that to be kind of disappointing on Miles Morales' part, and having a great antagonist really propels Peter Parker to having one of the better stories. But let's get into our next point, which is the sacrifice at the end of the stories. I feel like this is another pivotal thing in any Spider-Man related stories, which is the sacrifice that he has to give up at the end, and this is a good culmination of everything in the game up to this point. In Spider-Man PS4, whenever Aunt May dies, it is deeply impactful. There's so much going on in that scene, and you can really tell from the expressions on Peter's face that he really does not want his Aunt May to die, and he almost goes through with his plan. And then on top of the reveal that she already knew that he was Spider-Man and simply let him live his life to the fullest as Spider-Man because she knew that's what he truly wanted to do, was absolutely heartbreaking. And to have to see Peter sit there and watch his aunt die right in front of him really was just heartbreaking and absolutely devastating to me as a player, and I'm pretty sure to all players around the world. The scene where the Tinkerer dies is still impactful, however, it's lacking that oomph to it because the Tinkerer ultimately dies to fix her mistake. She's basically just cleaning up her own mess, and she had plenty of opportunities to stop this earlier before it got to this point, and she's just sacrificing herself for effectively what was her mistake. I could go on with these examples, but my main point that I'm trying to get across is that Miles Morales' story is not as good due to not having as thoroughly fleshed out characters and not having emotionally resonant moments. Moving on to where Miles starts to come back from this 1-0 lead. The gameplay gives Miles Morales the edge that it needed to be able to hang with Peter Parker, as Peter Parker's combat was fine, but Miles Morales just takes on those fundamentals that Peter Parker established and builds on them to an insane degree that makes the game a lot more fun than its predecessor. On a fundamental level, the combat systems are the same, but Miles, instead of getting a wheel full of gadgets, gets Venom and cloaking ability. Both of these lead to the same issue later down the line of the game, which is that you end up being comically overpowered by the end. However, I still do believe that Miles Morales has a better system up till that point. My first point on why I think that Miles Morales' power system is better than Peter Parker's is because it actually makes you utilize stealth. Stealth is actually a valuable asset in Miles Morales, where in Peter Parker it was an option, but it was only an option for a short amount of time, and a lot of boss fights and mob areas, etc., they all almost negated your ability to use stealth. The main thing that I enjoy over Peter and Miles Morales, however, is the Venom system, because with Peter you have to clunkily switch between gadgets and that interrupts the entire flow of combat. However, with Miles, you can easily just pop a Venom ability whenever, wherever, and however you see fit. There's plenty of them for different situations, which are like Peter's gadgets, but you don't have to completely stop to switch between them, which makes it like 10 times more enjoyable. Speaking of the flow of gameplay being broken, one of the biggest gripes that I've just seen in general with Peter Parker, and I agree with heavily, is the fact that you have to play as Mary Jane. If I'm paying $60 for a game, I don't want to have to play as the main character's girlfriend that just walks around and puts herself in imminent danger until you can play as the guy that you paid $60 to play as. It's just not fun and quite boring and monotonous. However, I will admit that Spider-Man PS4 has far better bosses. Miles Morales only has 2 boss fights that immediately come to mind, despite me knowing that there are more than 2 boss fights in the game. And on top of that, they don't switch up the combat very much. Well, in Spider-Man PS4, you do actively have to change your strategies to adapt the boss that you're fighting to. In summary, I feel like Miles Morales had a significantly worse story than Peter Parker, but it took Peter Parker's gameplay mechanics and expanded on them and improved them to a degree that I thoroughly enjoy as a player. And I mainly look for gameplay in my games, so I find that a lot more enjoyable than the story. I really do appreciate you making it this far into the video, as this will be my first YouTube video like this. Hope that my content moving forward isn't this serious, but I wanted to try something a bit more serious, something a bit more goofy, and then, you know, just see how it works out, and then try to base my YouTube channel off there. If you really do have anything to say, please do leave it in the comments. I am trying to improve at the end of the day. Man, have a great one.